Apple in 2023 has a $3 trillion market cap, and a lot of the company's early success is generally attributed to Steve Jobs' early intuitions, not listening to customers, saying no to customers, etc. But these notions about Apple and Steve Jobs are often misconstrued, and often gives new founders this general delusion that their intuition will lead them to create a company as big as Apple. If you visit any college campus in America, for example, you can pick at least 20 students who will have a genius idea that isn't backed by market data, market research, or any experience whatsoever, but instead is fueled by the need to be the next Jobs. Let's talk about the Steve Jobbing effect, how you can detect that you're Steve Jobbing, and what to do instead of Steve Jobbing so that you can be a more efficient founder. Subscribe while you're here, it really helps a lot. Steve Jobs has been a mythical character in Silicon Valley for a very long time. But let's see how he has been portrayed in popular media. In the movie Jobs with Ashton Kutcher, there's a scene at 17 minutes where Wozniak, Apple's co-founder, shows Jobs the computer. The next scene is Steve pitching Wozniak to leave his company and create a company that will sell computers to individuals, and Wozniak simply says, "Nobody wants to buy a computer, nobody." And the audience thinks, wow. Jobs saw what Wozniak couldn't. He was simply a visionary who could see what others couldn't. And in the next scene, Jobs says, how does somebody know what they want if they've never even seen it? The movie is simply doubling down on the notion that Steve Jobs has an incredible intuition. The movie, unfortunately, is incredibly inaccurate. Steve Wozniak hated the movie himself because of the inaccuracies between the portrayal of the characters, the portrayal of himself, and the portrayal of his relationship with Steve Jobs. But the movie desperately wanted to lean into the myths surrounding Steve Jobs. And that's because people have always embraced the quotes from Steve Jobs, such as,
"But very rarely can your customers predict something that they don't even quite know they want yet." As an example, no market research could have led to the development of the Macintosh or the personal computer in the first place.
or our job is to figure out what they're going to want before they do. I think Henry Ford once said, if I'd asked customers what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse. People don't know what they want until you show it to them. That's why I never rely on market research. The funny thing is, Apple was never founded in this way, and Apple relies on millions of data points from its users before it can make a new decision on what to release, whether it's a new product or a new feature. Steve Jobs was a visionary, but his process of ideation, vision planning, and execution did not come out of thin air. He was accounting for what was around him, and he was making conclusions based on what was going on around him. In his biography book, for example, we can see why he understood that design was so important when he was at the Personal Computer Festival in 1976, and he realized that the Soul 20 was getting more attention from customers because it was simply better looking, which made him realize the importance of design at Apple. Popular media also credits Jobs for having the vision to take the personal computer beyond the hobbyist market. But the book credits Mike Markula, Apple's first big investor, for giving Jobs that idea. But despite all the efforts and all the trial and error that Steve Jobs put into creating products and his company, Apple is always credited to being the product of Steve Jobs' crazy intuitions. And now new founders think this is a blueprint that they can replicate over again. And that is Steve Jobbing. It's when founders rely on their intuition at every decision-making process rather than relying on data. A core principle of building a company is creating a service or a product where you're bringing value to someone. What is the customer paying for and what are they getting in return? If you can answer these following simple questions, you are probably Steve Jobbing. Number 1, what is the person paying for? Number 2, why is the person paying for the product? Number 3, who's that person that's paying for what you're selling? You can't really answer that question vaguely, you have to be a bit more specific. For example, you can't tell me, oh, the entire world or any person on the internet. You have to tell me something specific like, oh, pregnant women or people in the VR community. If you can't really answer this, or if you can't really tell me your market size, you probably are Steve Jobs. Number 4, what makes you think that people want what you're selling or what you're building? What are the data points that led you to your conclusion? Number 5, have you spoken to the people you think are your customers? Were you able to prove that the problem you thought existed exists for them? And number 6, are you relying on overall charisma or your personal presence to drive the success of your company? Do you often talk about how you are the founder to outsiders? Do you put that you have a CEO of your company everywhere that you can? And do you often give pep talks to your team when things go wrong rather than help? And Steve Jobbing isn't only for when you're forming a new company and you're starting now. It's also when you're making decisions throughout the company's making and throughout the lifetime of your product. For example, let's say one day the product product person asks all the developers to round all the buttons on the app by 3 pixels just because he thinks that this will drive engagement throughout the product. Ask him, what data does he have to back that up? Did the customers complain that the buttons were just too sharp? Do you guys even have customers? Or is this coming from a place of pure intuition? And if it's his intuition, he's probably Steve Jobbing and he's wasting your time. Accepting that you're Steve Jobbing is really hard, but being a founder is really tough and you need to spend your energy in multiple things. So removing your energy from Steve Jobbing might give you energy to do other things that will be more productive to you and your startup. Even Steve Jobs faced issues while relying solely on his intuitions. He released iTunes Ping, which was a massive failure for iTunes. And that idea was created out of thin air. It was just his intuition. Here are a few questions that you can start with. The questions that we just asked ourselves in the previous slide, just explore them again and be honest with yourself. But beyond these questions, here's some simple stuff from Y Combinator Startup School that are really good ideas to ask yourself if you don't have any customers yet. How did this idea come to you? Were you exposed to an environment which allowed you to make an observation while you were in that environment? Or were you just diving in as an outsider? Steve Jobs, for example, was not an outsider to the hobbyist community. He was part of a homebrew computer club, which gave him exposure to the hobbyist community and which gave him an idea of how things worked in the background. And that was all before Apple was founded. Question number 2. Have you been able to build a simple MVP so far? Just spend a weekend hacking at it, try to create the simplest version of your product and test it out on your customers. See if it works actually. Question number 4. Have you debated that the idea that you're working on is actually a good idea? Try debating it internally with yourself, try debating it with your team, or try debating it with outsiders or your customers. Question number 5. Have you checked whether other people have worked on this problem? If yes, why did they fail? Question number 6. Who is your competition? Your competition will be able to validate whether a market actually exists and whether you're actually working on a good idea or not. Question number 7. What are your customers doing right now to get around this problem? Now, if you already have a team and you already have a product going on, but you don't have any customers to give you feedback, here's what you should do. You should absolutely focus on getting customers. What I mean by that is making aesthetic changes at a very early stage and just tweaking and trying to be a perfectionist doesn't really help. You need to get your product in the hands of the customers as soon as possible. Figure out what you need to do to get that product in the hands of your customers, and make sure you understand that when you started the startup, you had a hypothesis that your product was supposed to help your customer with something. When you're giving your product to that customer, you need to make sure that that customer is using that product in that way that you intended or what's happening. All right, once you get a few customers, I think the conversation becomes a different thing and you'll try to figure out how to grow your company and keep delivering value to your customers. If you've watched so far, please consider liking, subscribing, and try to stop being a Steve Jobs impressionist. I want to thank Kaysen Idon 7607 for commenting on my previous video. I really appreciate your support. Thank you.